Anniversary titles for game franchises can sometimes be a very special occasion. Sometimes they're just yet another entry that doesn't do an awful lot to stand out, and mostly serves as another game. Sometimes they're simply a collection of past games as a cheaper alternative and compact package to experience many titles all on one disc. And sometimes, they strive to be a jubilee of what's come before in the most heartfelt way, doing everything possible to give love to a bunch of different fans and series of the past, regardless of reputation and quality. Sonic Generations serves to be a mix of these, although it's got both of its feet firmly planted on the third example, continuing the boost gameplay present in the major playstyle of the time, while giving equal attention to the gameplay that kicked it all off on the Sega Genesis. It's not the best at anything it does gameplay-wise. In fact, a good chunk of its gameplay is middling, but its graphical presentation, respect it shows to the franchise, and the little time it wastes of players are all second to none. It's got defined focus in a franchise that has reinvented itself a dozen times over, has had many spin-off series, and introduced other miscellaneous gimmicks thrown into what started off as a comparatively very tame momentum-based platformer that managed to turn a majority of the gaming landscape's attention to it, even if just for a moment. I'll be looking exclusively at the PC release, so there's no comment from me on the console versions and their respective performance. The Steam version is definitely under the curve of functional though, as while it runs just fine most of the time, things such as editing the shadow and reflection quality to either high or low, and the number of hertz are close to the only tweaks available. And that's basically it. Simple things such as playing in windowed mode, allowing for easily changed controls, or having more resolution sizes than the oddly very specific ones available are just missing. Changing shadows and reflections does almost nothing to affect performance, and alt-tabbing to separate applications takes way longer than it needs to. Whether it was a lack of care or a lack of resources, this port has me give a strong recommendation of installing the Hedge mod manager that's thankfully user-friendly. It's a mod manager for the game which lets you easily toggle a wide assortment of fixes for many issues, alongside other gameplay novelties if that's more to your taste. Normally I don't care to mention mod scenes for games, but this one gets my avid recommendation. Numerous mods on Game Banana get rid of most crashes, input lag, frame stutters, allow for upres textures, allow for minimalist textures, speed up loading screens, resolve alt-tabbing to be instant, among many other things. Most technical hiccups the original version had are removed this way, bringing it up to a level it should have been released at, besides the other numerous gameplay and graphical modifiers also available. The most important ones used for this video, and that I recommend, will be in the description. Modding the game is the same way you can also remedy the very asinine design choice of having a single measly save file. There's literally no reason there weren't more save slots. The unlockable version of Sonic 1 that was on the PS3 and Xbox 360 is also just missing from the PC release outright, for as little as that's worth. The graphics have at least managed to not be completely mangled in the porting process, and besides some tweaking and brushing up mods allow for, this is still a very good looking game all around. The presentation is very top of the line, and so much effort made in the service of the blazing fast speed Sonic is known for paid off in spades, making this the best looking 3D Sonic game in existence. Much of the foundation for stages in terms of textures and models are something that rarely look low res, choppy, or blurry, and are often moving around in some way, which also extends to the different skyboxes made out of clouds to give locations an even more believable, habitable appearance. Levels have a wide variety of set pieces to further set them apart from one another, whether it's Chemical Plant going from a constant smog-expelling factory that later starts flooding and even exploding as it collapses, when the original didn't feature something nearly so grand. Or what about the Death Egg launching off in the background for Sky Sanctuary, slowly releasing hordes of Eggman robots to quickly swarm the once untouched gardens and civilization remnants, coupled with the different modern interpretations of those same crumbling structures that now look fantastic. Or being chased by the giant chopper up a long and winding rail it's tearing apart without a second's thought, until water spews out from the top of the cave as the cherry on top, to shortly thereafter running past a beautiful and very detailed underpass. It makes a sloped and just slightly winding straight line of level design with a few rings on it look very fun to do. Or what about the gun truck chasing down Sonic to the ends of the earth, making very sharp turns from street corner to street corner, lowering its ravenous, giant saw blades multiple times until it activates the jet engines and uses those as a last-ditch effort to catch up. It's the type of spectacle near perfect for this game, a modern interpretation of the gun truck from SA2 in the most over-the-top way they could manage. The camera is also used very well for added spice and emphasis on the third dimension. Many times it swerved around to give a non-standard view of speedy set pieces, and even for basic movement between platforming sections. A strict hallway or 2D look isn't a binary perspective this game holds, far from it. The constantly trailing camera was pulled back to give better views of the action, like when frantically swinging off of construction pulleys high in the air, or for oppositely mundane things like launching between two very closely placed springs. Up, down, and all around are an apt way to describe the camera's placement. Most bosses also sport their own stage assets made solely for their fights instead of relying on already existing stage models as that added extra bit of care and consideration. Whether it's fighting in a room that has a wide display of outer space, with swerving trains repeatedly exiting to make rounds, or a sizable racetrack to compete on, these don't feel like downgrades to the main stages either. They received plenty of attention when they easily could have been made out of stage assets transferred over. Out of 7 boss fights, only Silver and Perfect Chaos to some extent are the exceptions to this rule with the reuse of buildings they have. That's about as far as it goes for recycling in this regard. Animations all around are also very lively and expressive. Standard enemies have a high level of polish and weight to their different expressions, whether it's with their attacks or how a few will laugh and mock you if they land a hit, being such an amusing antithesis to the robotic nature. Their moving appendages and limbs respond to not only attack recoil, but also have small differences considered in their posing when looking around, even though these details will be completely ignored by a vast majority of players. Furthermore, robots carry this nice metallic sheen with well-defined lines, and each enemy also moves as they would be expected to, carefully prowling forward on all 4 legs, or simply floating in place with their own expressiveness. Eye candy is everywhere in this game, even for enemies that will die within a couple of frames. I really do mean everywhere. I could still go on about the different glowing parts of stages, the surprisingly high amount of idle animations, the way smoke and air effects flow, how nice the water shines, how good the different birds look for each respective stage they're in, the really well realized and furniture-filled interiors of buildings, etc, etc. A couple of different spots in this game are fleshed out, lively, and dense enough to make me more than happy to use them as screen wallpapers. Overall, little space isn't being put to use. And the one noteworthy complaint that might come from someone, it's how some of these original counterparts have been represented. The game shows a lean to a more realistic and serious style, unlike what some of the franchise represents, namely classic Sonic's more whimsical and lighthearted signature. A comparison between enemies shows the change of designs to even more ferocious than they ever were, as with the Buzz Bombers or Sandworms. Their eyes now glow and are partially covered by eyelids to make them look even more imposing when compared to the just dead and bulbous spheres the originals had. Environments also have way more realistic detail than they ever did, with lush vegetation or the different floors and walls, and the usage of color in Generations is also generally much more subdued and carries less of that same vibrance. Neon colors are used very sparingly when the Genesis titles made avid use of them. Everything is still very well made, but universal pinpoint accuracy wasn't the artist's desired direction. Be that as it may, there's much more to say on the representation of past Sonic games other than just stylistic choices. It's how this game also does its best to pay respects and represent gameplay for what they likely thought as the biggest sections of the fandom, perhaps trying to appeal to the most Sonic fans that realistically could simultaneously. It does leave out a notable chunk of fans that enjoyed the 3D titles that happened between Sonic 3 and Sonic Unleashed or so, as a potential third style, because this time gap spans from about 1994 and 2008. Roughly a decade worth of games has no version of Sonic that represents it appropriately. In hindsight, this franchise stepping on glowing hot coals with its spastic and unfocused gimmick experimenting history. Whether it's fans of Sonic Colors that wanted more wisps to be included, the fans of the storybook games not getting any stage representation, or the other numerous Sonic playstyles and spin-offs that existed as other potential minigame add-ons, the end result isn't the ideal version of this game. Not having an adventure-esque styled Sonic playstyle is a fair qualm to have, I think, but it's hard to say how much resources would have been sacrificed to even make it feasible. The selection of stages was well hand-picked across Sonic's wide-spanning history, leaning to have some of the more iconic choices such as Chemical Plant or City Escape, and also not being overly biased to any specific time period. The variety is just as solid in terms of different themes as well. The different titles and even vague characters that also got inclusions in some fashion is a roster with some surprisingly deep cuts. City Escape and Speed Highway are the two prime examples to point to where the developers took advantage of each level having advertisements and signs everywhere to simply reference characters. The street names and businesses have their names and owners to be the ones of Sonic characters, extending to a few obscure picks relegated to spin-offs, or those having more presence in the comics than they ever will in the games. If I cared even a little about Sonic lore, I'd be questioning most of the in-universe viability for these services, but that's not for me to gripe about. An equal amount of diversified representation is also in the game's additional collectible music tracks. Most major releases get at least some presence, and this also extends to titles that most haven't even heard of. The Sonic Advance, Riders, Storybook games, and even the two Sonic Rivals games made it into the music list. Saying the developers didn't do their research in this category would be very off base. This game's pacing is likewise very respectable, and it's very likely the reason some people say it's too short or lacking in content, even if I disagree with that sentiment. Game pacing can come in many forms, with some of the worst outcomes resulting in a few hours doing the most mundane and out-of-place tasks possible. Generations isn't a game where this is an issue though. They pulled in the reins as opposed to caving into the fears of dollars meaning hours per content. To progress through the main game, the following is needed. Finish 9 stages with 1 act for modern and classic Sonic. Beat 6 boss fights, and complete only 9 of the game's 90 missions. The game is set apart into 3 chunks of content with 3 zones, 30 missions, and 2 bosses each. The boss gate needs only 3 missions from its respective section to unlock, and beating the boss in each gate then unlocks the next section of content. Once all 3 sections are finished, and all Chaos Emeralds are amassed, the final boss is available. That's it, there's no catch here. They're fairly diverse in their challenges while focusing on recontextualizing the game's speedy platforming appeal. Most are very snacky, as they last only about a minute to 2 minutes to complete, and there's always the option to not do anything different and simply replay either act of a stage one more time with a doppelganger mission. There's no inflation of content here that's artificial or out of place. Stages haven't been clearly copied and pasted with minimal changes or slow-paced gimmicks sloppily inserted while being made mandatory. There's no playstyles people that come to Sonic games just for the high-speed platforming action are likely to be annoyed by or lack a good reason to be invested in. There's nothing like asking the player to redo the entire campaign several times just to get the true ending with also minimal changes. There's no forced collection of very out-of-the-way medals that don't adhere to the main level design organically. There's no really annoying set of special stages for the Chaos Emeralds that are either clumsy to play or even clumsier to get into, while also having the game suggest the player do the side quest to get the full experience thanks to the narrative ties it has. You're really just here to play what you came here for, which is one of this game's most understated and underappreciated aspects. The missions and extra side objective within stages of collecting red rings are both for bonus goodies, and so they really do feel just like extra content to get a bit more mileage. Nothing more, nothing less. The main stages for this game all round have a fair amount of replayability as well due to every single level having multiple paths that incentivize optimal play, and each act also has 5 red rings to find as a bonus for basic exploration. These both unlock music and concept art, then later a skill once all 5 for an act are collected. They're a neat, additional extra, usually easy enough to go for objective that also has hints towards every single one in each stage given by whatever character stands next to the respective level portal. It'd be a bit better if they were listed in the order they can be collected, and if the hints were easily readable at any time, because only one hint is shown for one ring until it's collected. Then the game shows another hint, and you also can't go back to read past hints. It's also nice every character acknowledges your efforts for collecting them in their own respective dialogue at least. Most of either act revolve around ideas taken from the original stages they represent, whether it's Act 1 or Act 2 and redone in a more modern format, which is most noteworthy for the oldest titles that didn't get to see the light of day on hardware capable of the third dimension, feeling the most novel as a result. A few fairly obvious references exist here and there to past level designs, but most of what is gone through is brand new in stage layout and challenges, or redone in a way that's refreshing and different enough to separate itself from the source material, and that's besides the uniform visual style. City Escape for modern Sonic is the sole exception where the redone version of the original is too samey, I'd say. Liberties were taken with places not represented in each stage's original games, such as the indoor gardens in Sky Sanctuary that weren't found anywhere in Sonic 3, the insides of buildings like gyms and malls in the different parts of Speed Highway, or the much more up-close and expansive polluted lakes of Planet Wisp. Level design for this game is also pretty flawless. In other words, it's hard to find much wrong across the board in terms of unfair placements or badly telegraphed hazards. A few acts have reason enough to be pointed out to in relation to the whole cast, however, for better and for worse. Planet Wisp is where a majority of either act is made up of slow platforming alongside needless and uninteresting usage of wisps. Act 1 has a spike wisp used in a simple lock and key prospect when the stage is already filled to the brim with fairly standard, blocky platforming, and not enough of it adheres to a smooth or interesting level layout. Act 2 has a focus on the rocket wisp while nothing can be done to break through the blocks faster, being a spectacle that is fairly mundane unlike how the rest of the game tends to be, or how you can possibly fall back down to redo sections of level again, having to do a progressively annoying stretch of platforming if you fall off, when having more checkpoints alongside more death planes would probably have been the better choice. The simple act of turning into a rocket or spike to destroy gates is as simple as it sounds. The chances to use them for shortcuts or in clever ways is fickle, and both of these levels plainly just overstay their welcome. There's no big cool set piece to point to for either of these, and the quality of life changes made to the wisps from their original versions doesn't do an awful lot to remedy their boredom. On the opposite end of the spectrum is a constantly praised seaside hill thanks to its surprisingly expansive girth. Intertwining split path design is heavily focused on, unlike the momentary shortcuts in most of the other stages. It's constantly possible to fall down, or climb back up to a different route, that manage to be pretty different from each other in their respective platforming challenges. Replaying either of these a few times, especially modern Sonic's version, is something that gets staler much slower than the rest of the game. In terms of pure level design, this modern Sonic Boost stage is the best one for the Boost playstyle ever, hands down. While some of these pathways are far from great or interesting, and it could have maybe gone without the no-go zones for some of the water, the vast space to explore and numerous routes show the level designers making the most use of the space available. The camera is used very well to help put on spectacle, but when it comes to showing breakable obstacles and opportunities for faster paths appropriately, it's sometimes very sloppy. Having a camera that isn't anywhere near as constrained as it was for the classic titles means it can be panned or tilted freely, thanks to the hardware this game is made on simply supporting a camera system like this. And yet, paths appearing in the blink of an eye, and relying on strict route memorization is instead what it comes down to. Boosting or spin dashing blindly into hazards and pits is fairly rare, but showing off and to much less accessing alternate routes is what some levels can be expressively bad at. There's a good amount of examples of paths to jump to that are either relying on tiptoeing forwards, or just knowing where they are, because even with how Twitch reliant some parts of this game can be, they're way too fast to be reactable. There's the argument to be made that memorization is part of the appeal and reward here, which I very firmly disagree with, and certainly think the game stands to lose much more than it gains by simply having the camera be so close to Sonic for these sections. Pulling back the camera on demand is already an option within the game's 2D hub anyways, for something so oppositely mundane and hazard-free. Regardless, the big attraction for this game in particular would be this game's set of boost stages, usually heralded as the best this playstyle ever managed to be. Modern Sonic's boost formula is one that mainly focuses on spectacle from a very fast sense of speed, and being able to manage both the boost meter and movement to maintain that spectacle. There's a much bigger and separate discussion to be had about the overall execution of 3D Sonic, thanks to the constantly changing direction and vision, and Sonic Team never trying to refine some prospects for more than a few titles at a time, the boost playstyle managing to be an avid exception to this. Said boost playstyle is one that could be criticized about even being fit for Sonic in the first place, but it's not a proper discussion for this video, outside of mentioning how nuance and controls or momentum to fling Sonic to different places as seen in the classics or adventure titles was sacrificed in favor of a control scheme that's much more like a car. Sonic feels somewhat stiff and inflexible, with an on-command nitro-styled boost to rocket forward and treat any enemies or breakable blocks as little more than drywall. One of the few times momentum really had a place was when using the boost to fly in the air very momentarily to make or reach some shortcuts, or off of some ramps. Drifting and scripted turning was introduced as a way to turn corners with any sense of flow, alongside full jumps feeling more committal than ever, and Sonic being reliant on the boost in order to maintain and reach a top speed. Levels were much more like strict, designated racetracks than playgrounds for expression and exploration. Speedrunning was also sometimes a secondary focus, Sonic Unleashed for the Wii and PS2 being the single title that focused exclusively on optimizing time, while the other boost titles gave more distributed weight towards collectibles found throughout stages or having either of these be tallied for points, alongside other types of goals in order to get a good rank for each level. That being said, this entry in the boost style managed to avoid a good number of pitfalls that past games had, as the controls for Boost Sonic are fairly serviceable this time around, with nothing in the way of locking a good amount of the available moveset behind wisps or slowly collectible upgrades. There's also no worry about any obscene button mappings, or moves being only specifically active during some level set pieces. What can be equipped via skills is also more additional than feeling necessary for the default experience. This game still has sections of it dedicated to platforming not befitting of this Sonic's control scheme though, specifically the slower and especially mandatory 2D sections, but they're at least not overly demanding in precision and don't typically last too long. The boostless acceleration and inflexible jump are namely what makes these parts feel sluggish and plodding. Having listed what this playstyle typically goes for, and what this specific title's strengths and weaknesses are, there's a big problem that still went completely ignored. What needed to be included the most for this iteration of the boost formula was having more engagement alongside more nuance. That is to say, even when only looking at the other boost entries for reference, boost management really isn't a concern here, and playing well doesn't reward boost the way it should. This brings us to the often forgotten twin brother of the first boost iteration, Sonic Unleashed for the 6th gen consoles, which I'll refer to Sonic Unleashed from now on. In Sonic Unleashed, there were systems in place so that managing the boost meter was something that had many sources that influenced how it worked, was rewarded, and also maintained. Action chains and ring level ups were the two big pillars that supported the surprisingly strong, skill interactive foundation in this entry of the boost formula. Action chains were a system that rewarded doing enough specific actions quickly one after the other, giving incentive to keeping a good pace throughout levels or capitalizing on some opportunities to do more moves for a bigger bonus. These were exclusively started by defeating enemies, but past that, defeating any enemies after the initial one, doing light speed dashes, going through boost rings, landing on grind rails, hitting springs, and running on boost pads were just some of the different ways to increase the action chain. The more actions that were done in a timed sequence, the larger the boost reward was. Ring level ups were also introduced as a way to give rings a bigger and more worthwhile goal to strive for, expanding the boost bar for extra stock, and filling up the meter completely when a ring level up was achieved. Any amount of rings that Sonic had past 60 were always sent back down to 60 on the dot, so amassing a stock of sometimes 400 still came with more of a risk than just losing time. Getting hit or falling into pits also lowered the boost bar down, or even set it back down to 0 outright, so rings weren't solely gas for the tank. Besides these two systems, we had others that also added both depth and breadth, those being how boost was also spent in segments rather than something that could be held by pressing down the button endlessly, so not only was keeping a good timing needed to continue boosting optimally, but at times caution had to be exercised of how and when it was spent, because while cancelling was possible, it always spent the whole bar that was used to initiate it. Poor movement was punished when running into walls at different speeds, resulting in different wall slams depending on how fast Sonic was going. Skidding up against the wall also cancelled any ongoing boosts as another punishment. The stomp carried momentum while in the air for added flow, instead of making things come to a screeching halt whenever reaching the ground sooner was preferred. Now, ignore everything I just explained in detail, because none of the previously stated systems are in Sonic Generations. The only two that are actually present from Unleashed are the Drift bonus and Starting Boost, both of these still being very insignificant and understated. Drifting in Generations actually rewards meter like it used to in Unleashed, but the reward is now even more insignificant with it being a razor shavings worth. It will practically never give more than the start of a boost. The boost at the start of a stage is now back, but it's for whatever reason tied to a skill instead of just being part of the base moveset, and it's near meaningless. All it really allows for is being able to boost a couple of frames sooner, because in Sonic Generations you always start levels with a full bar of boost anyways. In Unleashed you had the same starting boost, and it actually had 3 results to the countdown at the beginning of a level. One where Sonic fumbled on the ground for starting it too soon, one where the spin dash gives a good start, and the most optimal one where timing it even closer to the end of the countdown give a free bar boost alongside the spin dash start. This is worth noting as they started stages with no boost in this game. The systems in Unleashed still had their own faults, but I think if they were simply copied and pasted while making the current boost rewards in Generations be half or even a third of their current amount, I would go a country mile in expanding the gameplay into what would be much more fulfilling and satisfying. The Unleashed boost stages could have been some of the most maliciously and poorly designed 3D Sonic levels in existence, and even if they had been, I still would have wanted future boost titles to take its numerous systems and iterate upon them. They were really something worth evolving. As an experiment, there's a mod that transfers some of the levels of Sonic Unleashed to Generations to see how they would play with a different version of Sonic, and most of the gameplay systems stripped of it. Really the only compliment I can give Generations over Unleashed and that boost gameplay is that the one in Generations is much faster, making the levels a bit better spectacle-wise, and simply lowering how much time they take to complete. It makes the once considered interactions with level objects and enemies a snooze fest that are all easily ignorable, and boost management is very absent. The straight hallways of level design are now boring time spent holding the Go Faster button until Sonic finally gets to the next line of enemies or platforms, and with plenty of boost to spend with no strings attached. A good amount of the stages in Unleashed really were straightforward and not too route diverse outside of the last few, but its systems did so much legwork to make it fun to push the mechanics. I can't even necessarily say the version of Sonic in Generations inherently controls better, because the Unleashed levels were also made with its respective control scheme in mind. Being able to go so fast makes these stages really hard to traverse as intended sometimes, whether it's boosting into pits or going too fast to properly take some shortcuts. The Maniac speeds are really unwieldy here. Regardless, another thing to mention about the boost titles was mandatory and optional QuickTime events when launching off of specific stage objects, and for Generations they've been relegated to being part of rainbow ramps and rings for additional way to gather boosts during a stage. It's a momentary distraction to occupy players while they wait to land somewhere. This is also very elementary. Performing tricks in this game is way too easy. I like how it can overflow the meter bar as extra stock, and the timing involved when wanting to end the stunts before reaching the ground for a bigger bonus is nice. But up until that point, the directions moved in will give optimal boost as long as you don't do the same direction twice in a row. This is much less challenging and interesting than the QuickTime events in the HD version of Sonic Unleashed, and arguably Unleashed as well, even with how simple and preset they were in that game. Having it so random on-screen prompts of what direction needed to be pressed for the boost, or asking for way more variety in inputs would have made these moments way less of a mindless task. As a potential nice added touch, they could have also let the player do tricks as quick as one could react to these on-screen prompts, alongside being able to finish tricks at any part of regular stunts for that added bit of risk and reward. Overall, boost rewards are also simply way too generous. Running out of meter is rarely a concern, and filling it comes about as easy as breathing. Meter gained from collecting rings and defeating enemies is constantly going unused due to the somewhat low cost of starting and holding a boost. Only 4 enemies need to be destroyed to get half of a full gauge, and rings are also very present everywhere, when a full bar of boost already lasts 14 seconds from start to finish by itself. The constant showering of boost meter is what makes many of the skills that influence how much meter is at your disposal rather filler-like in their additions. The skills in the shop could have helped this game compete in terms of interactable systems and boost management with Unleashed, but the high equip costs and surface level applications means they don't amount to much more than neat luxuries. On the other side of the coin is Classic Sonic. This iteration of Classic Sonic shows off a few quality of life improvements that are long overdue. Activating a super form and the spin dash now have separate button mappings to avoid any bothersome overlap. They're both smart additions to the base feel and controls that's appropriate and really only adds to Classic's gameplay. Alongside this entry combining the method of charging a spin dash of Sonic CD and Sonic 2 for the best of both worlds. Lower skilled players don't have to press repeatedly to get a full boost, while better players can mash away and charge it faster. Almost everything else about this gameplay style's iconic fluidity and subtlety is absent though. The main problem with Classic Sonic in this game stems from how he controls. He's meant to be a modern representation of the Genesis titles with the benefits of being in full 3D, but he's in a rough state. Things such as the top speed, base running acceleration, and horizontal jump control are fine, but in other ways Classic Sonic is stiff, heavy, and lacks most of the momentum nuance the Genesis titles had, feeling like Boost Sonic even though the race car feel isn't what this version should feel like. The momentum the Genesis Sonic games are known for is now pretty janky, particularly when trying to roll down slopes. Speed isn't maintained for too long, and almost none is gained, even on the biggest of inclines, so rolling into a ball regardless of how high a slope is results in the equivalent of trying to bowl through mud. One of the things Sonic is most known for, rolling around at the speed of sound, simply doesn't work anymore. And yet, somehow modern Sonic Slide is leagues better at keeping momentum when put side by side. Jumps are also shorter and less floatier than they should be. I found myself repeatedly surprised when I make some leaps, and stopping myself from doing others when they would have needed no hesitation to do on the Genesis. The jump keeps some shortcuts that could be accessed with some careful movement very awkward, if not a faraway dream. Aside from his wonky momentum and hefty jump, he's also not slowed down nearly as much underwater as he should be, but this is more of a nitpick than a complaint. I doubt almost anyone will truly mind the lack of sluggishness as a weight inaccuracy for water sections. The spin dash is expectedly here too, and it's a crutch that makes some segments possible at all to traverse, serving as a band-aid solution to level design as something that's clearly untested and unfinished. It helps players avoid getting stuck by giving a free massive speed boost whenever on the ground, or lets Sonic fly over big parts of level design with very little thought, taking away much of the challenge instantaneously with zero prerequisites to doing so other than some decent jump timing. A few times it's outright mandatory to progress, which is where its max speed makes sense, but these are avid exceptions to the rule. His max speed also puts modern Sonic to shame. For comparison, this is how far Classic travels in the hub from a single, half-second long, fully revved spin dash as opposed to modern Sonic boosting for 5 seconds straight. There also needed to be more control over how fast it goes too, given influencing its max range is a daydream. It's either held for a fifth of a second and goes nowhere, or held for half a second and rockets off at Mach 12. The build-up is insane. Well, while jumps to reach places might be needlessly tense to accomplish, experimenting with rolling physics is a crapshoot, and the spin dash can easily remove any challenge from some platforming sections. There's still the level design to cover. A sizable chunk of the classic Sonic-styled levels end up being very middle of the road and unremarkable. Most stages are almost far away from the best the Genesis had to offer, in terms of shakeups, size, gimmick variety, and length. The two avid exceptions that stand out are Seaside Hill and Sky Sanctuary, both of these Act 1s being well made and taking good advantage of the classic level design ideology, while making sure each path had substantially different content to interact with. More often than not, stages feature a gimmick they center their platforming on, or have one that takes notable precedence. This was a decent choice of direction to take in order to show what was not possible with this gameplay style with several years of hardware advancements since then. Stages like City Escape have the gun truck constantly harassing the player in and out of the background as different types of platforms are torn to shreds or stacks of them are deleted over time. Crisis City has its massive fire tornado that will pull players into it while progressively getting rid of, and moving platforms around. Or Rooftop Run having a giant barrel gimmick to interact with in a couple of different ways. These stand out as examples of presenting their stage themes in fitting and creative manners, so they managed to pull their weight and reach a serviceable enough quality. Meanwhile, Green Hill, Chemical Plant, Speed Highway, and Planet Wisp don't offer a whole lot. Much of their design resorts to just fairly standard platforming without anything in terms of interesting subversions. Something like Speed Highway is surprisingly lacking in speedy set pieces unlike modern Sonic's version. Instead, it's an over-reliance on the platforms on conveyor belts. It's Speed Highway, but the complete opposite of its name in terms of gameplay. I struggle to call classic Sonic's levels bad, but if the controls were fine-tuned, or even one-to-one with the original games, you'd still be left with a selection of levels where roughly half of them don't really do too much to be interesting. The iconic momentum nuances are dead, and the controls are unbalanced, unstable, and subpar. Checkpoint minigames or special stage rings to find have been completely forgotten, while secrets are also often a rarity, so exploring or doing out-of-the-way platforming challenges for a few ring or one-up monitors is rarely incentivized. Red rings doing very little to make up for lost ground in terms of optional goodies classic Sonic was chock full of. The modern attempt at this playstyle brings about a few camera angles for different views of the action, but they're usually surface level, or uninteresting, because most levels for classic don't ever intertwine in interesting ways, and while visually striking, ultimately don't affect gameplay much. Essentially, classic Sonic just sort of plainly exists. It's the playstyle for this game I don't really look forward to doing. It doesn't harbor most of what made it so iconic and well regarded, trying to emulate what got Sonic on the map without what made it special. Controls like a cheap imitation, and has a mediocre selection of levels to go through, most of their spice and girth being unremarkable, and their gameplay realization for the most part not being much higher than Sonic 1. I don't say this just to disparage this game's callback to its roots either. Comparing both Sonic Generations and Sonic 1's versions of Green Hill helps show how much we've progressed in plain enemy usage. Green Hill in Sonic 1 sports 32 enemies, while the version in Generations sports 21 in total. It's a bit of a gap, and especially more so when you realize this is only comparing Act 1 of Green Hill, not all three combined. There's a good amount of empty space here with nothing really going on other than just moving forwards or upwards. Speaking of Sonic 1, part of what Sonic was founded on in its first title was the idea of mastery via repeated playthroughs, fostering optimization of level routing and control dexterity, although many titles somehow never particularly capitalized upon it outside of a separately designated time attack mode, somehow never being a game's main focus. Here we return to Sonic Unleashed's prospect of simply making it fast enough to the end, albeit with an added stipulation or two. Whenever Sonic dies, the rank is lowered by 1 letter grade, but this doesn't stack. Collected rings also add to a ring bonus tallied at the end. Its current iteration is one that hands out more punishment for getting hit than just losing time, as dying knocks the rank down by 1, and losing rings could, theoretically, be the difference between getting some rank grades thanks to the ring bonus. There's a weird flaw that for some reason, S ranks only show on the top right of the screen while you do missions, and not for the main acts or boss fights. even though missions are content secondary to the main experience. Then there's the much bigger problem, and that's how the rank system in this game is effectively non-existent. Most people probably won't see a C rank or lower, ever. The very common criticism of this game's pathetically easy S ranks is pretty well deserved. All of the main acts and bosses have S ranks that can be gotten on a whim. Even when testing different levels, not boosting or spin dashing at all still easily nets the S rank regardless. And it's mainly due to something fairly undocumented and really understated. The system has a particular quirk where the aforementioned ring bonus isn't displayed correctly, and the values are nonsense. The base version of Chemical Plants Act 2 has an S rank time of 3 minutes when there's not a single ring picked up. Having 100 rings when reaching the goal extends the S rank time up to a whopping 5 minutes and 5 seconds, applying similarly for every other non-mission rank. I do also think people forget to mention the true S ranks. Each act for both Classic and Modern have a doppelganger mission where the levels are the same, but the S rank is stricter. By true, I mean that they're more challenging to go for, as ring bonuses also don't exist for missions. I do think they could have stuck to their guns about not allowing for deaths, because you can die as many times as needed as long as you reach the goal in time for these. They still don't ask people to practice the game as much as they should, but the missions can potentially pose a decent challenge to less skilled players. There's not much else to say about the rank system here. I'm glad it's one that's very simple and easy to understand, thus leaving out a ton of questions people might have about it, and what to actually strive for when playing stages in order to get the best rank. But that's my sole compliment. Much of the minutiae of either Sonic in regards to the usage of momentum, secret hunting, emerald collecting, action chains, ring level ups, or other factors just don't exist. While some of these weren't necessary as inclusions, their absence is one that's sorely missed. And the rank system only being lime juice on a wound because ranks could have served as simple goals to strive for by learning the ins and outs of the game, and pushing the currently existing mechanics to their limits. But the majority of these ranks are rubbish. Any skill ceiling for this game is thus only out of self-imposed challenges, when tweaking the rank system overall would have taken very little playtesting or development resources. I haven't gone much to the bosses though, which are roughly run-of-the-mill if they were to be the subject of discussion. Their execution is just fine to somewhat boring, in a sense keeping in line with tradition as a result. They lack complexity or challenge more often than not, and the fact that they have harder versions is equal parts appreciated and forgettable. Hard mode for every boss does only a few insubstantial tweaks like adding extra hits or small changes to level layouts. Hard mode makes most bosses a bit better, but they're not the overhauls they desperately needed. Like with the main stages, the representations are a mix of old and new challenges. Probably the best thing is that none of these are exceedingly bothersome to do, but their potential was far from realized. Really, the most entertaining aspect for a majority are the introduction and closing cutscenes, rather than actually playing these. Simple note-taking left me wishing many aspects were much more challenging or dynamic. Metal Sonic, for example, is much more of a direct fight than his original race, but being able to hit him so consistently and easily with very little fear makes it too boring. The established fear of falling down the track isn't prominent past the first few seconds thanks to the spin dash, the same tool that trivializes hitting him during his charging or even charged phases. Even if you died in a single hit for this fight, Metal Sonic charging up or even being surrounded by sparks doesn't protect him from taking damage, regardless of Sonic's invulnerability frames. The Death Egg Robo amounts to dodging very slowly thrown out arms and easily spin dashing under the jumps for quicker damage. And the holes he makes in the ground for the first phase could have been gaps to jump over, but it's merely set dressing. To top it off, his window for damage is exceedingly long. All the time in the world can be taken when the arm is stretched out. Platforms could have stayed disappeared for longer, while bomb deployment is changed to be very short, so missing a bomb spawn could have forced players to move around the arena much more. Shadow's fight is equally uninteresting as well, with really lacking interactivity in most ways, and it has a pretty uninspired track design. Even though this is a full-on racetrack compared to the original's infinite straight line, I just might prefer the original version. Moves such as drifting, stomping, sliding, homing attacks, quick stepping, or even jumping are actually not necessary at all. Just boosting and moving the control stick, even on hard mode as well, still result in a fairly easy win. The track design doesn't support any interesting out-of-the-way shortcuts, or has a low ring count, so boost meter management is hardly ever a concern. Shadow can actually throw chaos spears while you both collect orbs, but this was so rare that I almost didn't see it when testing this fight several times. When Sonic collects enough orbs, it turns into a pretty mundane joke of a quick step section that doesn't even require jumps for the higher placed meteors. And when Shadow collects enough orbs, the roles are reversed for a mundane quick step section where you dodged placed spears. Wow. The two fights after these with Perfect Chaos and Silver are nothing noteworthy either. The former is just really an extra stage more than a dedicated fight, with surprisingly awkward placements of platforms that doesn't last too long. While the latter isn't much more than just an okay series of homing attack chains while sometimes dodging psychic knives, and boosting constantly to reach the White Hedgehog. The final part with the giant boulder of garbage can bring some good tension given it's actually instant death if you get rolled by it, but the rest is just barely average. Really, the Egg Dragoon is a single boss in this game I can actively call worth someone's time. It's surprisingly fleshed out when compared to most others, simply due to having different types of mechanical tasks. Rail grinding and switching, skydiving, and wall jumps are available as moves here, while he sports a wide assortment of drill, flame, and ice attacks to watch out for, alongside different weak points to homing attack, and chances for damage showing up that aren't blindingly easy to strike at. This is besides being a creative reimagining of the original. Most of the fights should have been much more like this one. While there's a devil's advocate position, or silver lining perspective to be had in pointing out how the numerous big windows for damage at least allow for more skilled players to better decide the pace of fights on their own, this doesn't account for the pretty low difficulty on normal or hard, or how this doesn't even extend to every fight all the time. These fights can't be sped up like the quickest ones on the Genesis. They spend too much time needlessly showing off spectacle or tumbling on the ground for the sake of it, rather than using these wait times in conjunction with the gameplay to inject a dose of tension or skillful observation. It's simply waiting around for them to make their move with nothing in terms of engagement, effectively being unskippable cutscenes that bog the pace down. There's still one more boss left though. It's the end-all be-all of this game, and it's the reason behind bringing back life and color into the life-drained locations. This was a great way to end the game conceptually. The design and spectacle of the time meter is of course top-notch, and the effort put into this unique playstyle is respectable, at least as a foundation. Well, I don't even hate the fight. My only feelings are ambivalence and contempt. Boost to win is a term that's wholly applicable here. It's actually just how it works. It lacks conveyance with even how to damage it first off, and the go-to way of fighting this boss is to hold down the boost and making sure to pick up the very planful trails of rings always near the center of the track until you ram into the time meter a few times, hold the bumpers down on the giant fireball, and you're done. I suppose I could comment a bit on its numerous elements, if only to try and say something remotely interesting as commentary. The controls consist of only very slowly floating around, boosting, launching your partner forwards to delete debris, and only debris mind you, and switching perspectives. It doesn't feel good to move at the speed of molasses while there's very little room for player expression. Switching between 2D and 3D doesn't mean much, as although some attacks change trajectory in how they're launched, you actually can't catch up or even hit the time meter no matter how long you boost in 2D, so don't even bother with switching. There's somehow no sources of damage, for some reason. Some past Sonic titles had super forms still damageable by a few things during their true final boss fights, but here whether it's ramming into debris of different stages, the homing drills, or even the giant laser and miniature sun that's fired, they're not a threat, really only potentially wasting more of your time. The time meter can slow down time, for some reason. I mean, hey, it fits. It might have possibly been meant to add dread for the homing shot attack he sets up as a psychological stressor, but again, there's no way to take damage in this boss fight. Launching either Sonic forward to destroy debris doesn't matter since the knockback it does is minimal, and it stops appearing after a few minutes, and in spite of the reticle the time meter has, you can only boost into it instead. The start of this section has me saying this boss is boost to win, but I really mean it. Just hold the boost button down for a few minutes until you can repeatedly reach the center orb, while your game audio is probably muted due to the very overbearing and even overlapping game babysitting advice. A last minute look at the game's files shows that there's completely scrapped concepts and ideas for this fight. Apparently rotating the control stick to escape a grab move, and helping out either version of Sonic in some way were planned in mechanics, although there's no graphical assets to back this up, only audio files.
Quickly rotate the left stick to escape! Quickly rotate the left stick to escape!
Charge in to help out the other Sonic! Charge in to help the other Sonic!
With this being in an alpha stage of development, it's only resulted in this ludicrous amount of voice clips. There's almost a whopping 400 lines of dialogue made for the final battle. totaling in over 11 minutes. Yeesh. It has the assets to be amazing, but suffice to say, the time meter is easily one of the most unfinished and untested fights in a game I have ever experienced.
Ha! That piece of junk.
Skills don't apply to the time meter though, with it being a completely separate, sectioned off chunk of content, which leads me to talk about the skill system as a whole. Making an interesting return from the storybook duology is a decent variety in skills to equip. It's a pretty solid idea to have a toggleable skill system that can potentially drastically influence how levels are played. Simply, skills are unlocked in a few notable ways, mainly by playing specific missions tied to skills, or by collecting all 5 red rings for a single act. The former makes them available for purchase in the shop for points, while the latter is the only requirement to get the ones tied to level collectibles. This decently incentivizes another aspect of level mastery outside of the main appeal, with exploring for the red rings, whilst having players try some side content that act as tutorials for how some skills can be used in stages. But points to buy things in the shop are peculiar. From my own experience, points received to unlock everything hover at an okay delivery for players, playing every stage and boss one time, and completing about half of the pretty smooth to go through missions should give enough to buy everything. Once you empty the shop though, points become worthless, and only let you purchase meaningless consumables only in the form of extra lives. I would have overhauled the system of unlocking skills by having all of the skills both viewable and purchasable from the shop at any given time, and letting players unlock any outside of the super form due to story reasons. Then remove the whole point system, and let players unlock skills by a varying amount of red rings for each. So this way you still keep incentive to explore levels, while players can much more easily experiment with appealing skills earlier on. Skills being tied to missions without a clear note of what mission gates or fully explored levels give which skills may have led to people being unaware of abilities they might have really enjoyed until after they spent all the playtime they would on this game. As a fun bonus, the developers could have also allowed players to equip any amount of skills as long as none of them were impossible to equip simultaneously, but lock this behind 100% completion. Possibly have ranks unattainable if a preset skill cost threshold is passed if that's preferred. There's only one rank time for each S rank after all, and ranks are also not influenced by equipped skills either. That's part of what makes the system suck though. When equipping skills, they each have a skill point cost attached, and a total limit of 5 at a time as balancing measures, but these limitations had very little thought put into them. Some are just really exceedingly expensive. Homing attacks as Classic Sonic are seen just as valuable as a super form. Equipping the time break might have been fine at 80 points, but it's not something you can even activate during some set pieces like simply grinding on rails or while performing tricks, or even freely toggle between slowed and regular time, and so it's way too committal. It's 70 points for equipping City Escape skateboard that simply neuters Classic Sonic's controls, when equipping an infinitely more useful elemental shield costs the same amount. It's 50 points as the cost for a skill that gives an extra life when lives are meaningless. It's 40 points for a skill that gives 10 rings upon a restart when rings are plentiful in this game, so on and so forth. The skill list furthermore consists of many redundant abilities that begs the question of how much playtesting they had whatsoever. Half of modern Sonic skills are toggleable changes to making boost easier to obtain and use, but again, boost is handed out in spades, so I fail to see the applications of these, much less having multiple of them active. One of the very few that particularly stands out to me in an actually good way is the Endless Boost skill, because in spite of what I've said about boost rewards by default, this effectively serves as a half-decent hard mode for modern Sonic. As no damage can be taken, it makes rings unattainable. The double whammy of the skill equip cost is the max amount at once, because even if one were to equip 5 cheap skills, that would be the cap? I really don't understand the logic of having 2 limiters for skill sets when just having balanced numbers of equip costs would have been enough. Not allowing for freely nameable skill sets is also weird. One is forced to only pick words from a specific list, for some reason. Skills serve as one of 2 notable inclusions of extra content for this game, the other being the mostly optional side challenges that are anything but variety stale, and their quantity is nothing to scoff at either. Every single one of the 9 zones has 5 extra challenges for both modern and classic Sonic, coming to a total of 90 missions for this entire game. On screen is the comprehensive list of how many different missions there are. The mission roster shows how outside of one type of mission, the concepts are rarely copied amongst one another. The number is thus a smidge inflated due to the doppelganger missions just being the main level acts, and they're completely unchanged, but now you simply have to do them faster, while being unable to collect red rings during them. Besides that, it's hard to say that the missions don't have some inspired premises. The main appeal of these to me is how the missions capitalize on assets not used significantly or at all in the main stages for one reason or another. Rooftop Run, for example, has a mission centered around hangable balloons that aren't present in the main acts. Some missions are focused exclusively on some level gimmicks like springs or four-way cannons. Others are the few missions that center around classic Sonic's elemental shields through designated obstacle courses, or they're ones that give the mostly hub stationary Amigo characters some love for a few minutes. A small gripe with the Amigo-styled missions existing is that I think these extra characters could have been added as their own individual skills in the shop, if that was easily portable to the skill system that is. While the S-rank times for missions are actually occasionally mildly challenging, they also have a really weird timer at the center top of the screen. This I completely don't understand. Most missions have a time limit to complete them under that's separate from rank times, but it's laughably long. For some reason it's this absurdly high, with the highest being around 10 minutes, when nearly all of them can be comfortably completed in a fourth of their timers at most. Some missions also sport revamped stage layouts alongside a few different times of day to help support their different stipulations. Frankly, I would have been more than fine if some of the efforts into putting as many missions as there are into instead making alternate versions of some of the main stages as a better profit gained from the effort, even though most of the changes are as plain as changing the time of day, then adding extra enemies and different platforms. I do think these missions are generally quality enough to be worth their place in the game at least. Decently fun content fairly in line with the main platforming action that isn't lazily done. It does nothing to impress, but also nothing to offend. On the subject of platforming, we have the level select hub that has that as part of its layout. It has the expected slopes, springs, speed boosters, and other objects placed around to give a plain level select more entertainment value, and thankfully still has a quick level select for that nice added touch of consideration. The quick switch unfortunately doesn't extend to the side missions and bosses though, coming off as obtuse in this regard. The 2D hub could have also been better laid out. Accessing some missions feels like it wastes a bit too much time trying to get to those that need a detour to reach. You can zoom in between 1 and 2 distances, but being able to zoom out even more to better see how to get to some specific missions would have been nice. This alongside more openings and platforms to jump through would have likely resolved any issues I have with the current layout. Getting to the very top of missions can be a pain, particularly for the missions of the last 2 zones. Making a hub that has the potential for platforming challenges within it had a solid idea to try and capitalize on this layout, with each mission spawning a bell to ring once they're completed, to then collect for extra music tracks or concept art. The music note mini challenges are pretty lacking in thought across the board. It took about 14 minutes to get all of them as built Sonics. It's a very neat idea for an overworld to use your platforming prowess to get around in, but they usually go in predetermined paths that are no challenge at all to nap them in, or even circle back completely. The challenge for some of these actually just being to stand still for 20 seconds. I think if the time for some of these was only 5 seconds, if they were fewer and more thought out, or if they were also much faster, then this wouldn't be such a rudimentary task to do, especially when they're all done in one fell swoop. It's another aspect of this game I can't comment much on, because it's an inclusion that's very one note. Well, once the music notes are collected, they all expand the roster of music for this game a fair bit. It's such a subjective and divisive topic, but there's a reason some notes you nap for more music are golden. The Sonic franchise was one of the very most consistent when it came to its tunes, regardless of era or even development studio, in which this game does a somewhat admirable job living up to. The way the music is fairly flexible with how it plays is all well and good, given there's not only a vast amount, but it gets used in neat ways with how Speed Choose music does more than just play the music track faster, adding more and different instruments besides the changed BPM. Likewise, being underwater and boosting changes it in other ways, to help add that bit of immersion and spectacle. The hub follows this high effort trend with every level entrance playing appropriate music remixes, whether it's for levels or bosses, being different for every single boss gate as well, in spite of their uniform appearances. Unlocked music also helped add to a list for a jukebox that allows for swappable music for any stage, mission, or boss is a cool addition. The celebration of the franchise's music with this was a very smart move, with a few remixes of those old tracks as well. You can also just listen to the tracks with the jukebox option in the leftmost room of the hub. But oddly enough, the remixes that aren't the major tracks are mostly reserved for the classic music on the Genesis. Even more weird is how not only old synthesized Sonic games exclusively are the ones to receive love, but Sonic 3 hogged inexplicably half of it too. It's also just a shame there isn't more of it. The act of simply adding a few more notable tracks per game is a rather effortless task that would have taken a day at most. Same for denoting which tracks are original or remixes. Somehow only 2 tracks are labeled as originals. The rest don't have any sort of wording to say if they're remixes or not. As we come to a close, there's the only extra downloadable content at the time of release. We received something a bit out of left field with the pinball table of all things. With it being such a completely unrelated and random inclusion as opposed to the very well received main game stages, it understandably left some people sour for what could have been made in its place. It'll come as a bit of a surprise then, that when I just tried to gather footage, I ended up spending way more time just fiddling around with it than I intended to. Just watching the ball go around and interact with the different board sections was enough to hold my attention, thanks to the high level of care present when fleshing this out. It's fairly well stylized to be properly Sonic themed, and has a ton of neon and moving flashing lights and managed to not be overbearing. The controller vibration feedback is also pretty well adjusted for that good feel. The physics feel pretty spot on too, long gone are the days of Adventure 1 or Heroes jank. Camera movement is used just as well as in the main acts, following the ball around compared to a very flat panning visual they could have done instead. Stylization also found in the title screen and the game's UI or text borders for these board textures is here, besides the dash pads and springs used to move around with golden statues of Tails and other characters' names present, to show they didn't skip out on looks for this pretty small part of the game. They also use this opportunity to go a step further from being just a regular pinball machine in many respects, adding flippers for the top portion as platforming sections of sorts, and a slot machine that rains down rings for that added novelty. Collectible medals are used to power a slot machine at the top as well, besides modern and classic Sonic being able to spin dash or boost as an added mechanic that fits this like a glove. This needed some more polish. Modern and classic Sonic have no difference aside from classic being able to aim as boosts and modern can't. Both have the same amount of boosts, and you can't refill the meter, even with rings. You only get the 3 you start with in spite of any number of lives or rings amassed. The game also has no failsafe for it sending Sonic flying somewhere abruptly and making you lose a life, but thankfully this is rare. Getting all the Chaos Emeralds to light up the board also doesn't result in any sort of reward or player acknowledgement, not even in the form of a simple achievement. Ultimately, a very amusing distraction that does a good job accomplishing its goal, even if it's not what most would have wanted, or what this game actually needed. That brings us to the end. The title for this video was a tricky one. I wasn't awfully sure how to negatively portray its first impression on people. While I know most will see the title as positive, it had another intention behind it. Here's the revelation. I called the celebration great, but not the game as well, having put one above the other. I think how this game manages to celebrate and present its franchise is more worthwhile than nearly anything it has gameplay-wise. Neither playstyle really adheres into either strengths all that well, and while no nonsense, fair, and competent level design, on top of lacking needless fluff is what keeps this game fun, it's, for the most part, far from a golden example of what could have been made. I still think it's a good game, and even remains a top 5 Sonic game, but I also think the fact that it simply doesn't overstay its welcome and has such good looks is the main reason it's remembered so fondly in the first place. It was a good premise that could have helped set up the future of Sonic, but it simply wasn't meant to be. Many of the Chronic series mistakes and mishaps still happened with its title successors, although to call them successes is exceedingly generous. This is a title from 2011 in a franchise that was once so adamantly respected, so enormously influential, but ended up having Sonic Generations be remembered as one of the very last commendable games for the Blue Blur. It's the final big hurrah in terms of main entries, instead of being a cool party in a constantly praised history.